This week's topic is state terrorism. And I think one of the first things that we need to do when we talk or think about state terrorism is to differentiate between the term terrorism and our notions of a small group, a non-state small group that is trying to harm a state or a community or a society. And the best way to do that, or to be able to discuss those things, is to think about terrorism as a tactic. If we're talking about it as a tactic, then that means that it can be used by any entity. It could be a non-state terror organization. It could be a random individual, our lone wolf cases, and it could be governments and states that intentionally, directly or indirectly engage or use this tactic of terrorism with the goal of intimidating the target or the target population so they would behave in a certain way or even change policies sometimes. Most of the time, state terrorism, when it's used in domestic politics, in the domestic arena, when the government turns on its own people, this is done in order to crush opposition, to make sure that there is no opposition and that everybody falls in line with the government. Internationally, or using terrorism or terrorist tactics in foreign policy, this is when the state, the government, decides that the best way in order to achieve national interests, and those could be economic, political, cultural, territorial, any of those national interests, that the best way to achieve those is to use direct or indirect terrorism. Indirect terrorism is what we call state-sponsored terrorism, and we see that happening quite a lot in many, many cases. So let's think a little bit more about state terrorism. The definition that the book provides you is that state terrorism is done by official government support for policies of violence, repression, and intimidation against perceived enemies that the state has determined threaten its interests and security. And again, this can be done domestically or as a tool for foreign policy. It's important to remember that state terrorism, while it might be considered dirty or not nice, is a rational choice for the state, for that specific state. So if Pakistan decides to be a state sponsor of terrorism or terror group that operate in Afghanistan, it is rational, it is the best cost-effective way for Pakistan to do business in Afghanistan, right? So again, this might not be nice or moral or the right thing to do, but in terms of policy and cost-benefit calculation, it is still a rational policy. Now, generally speaking, terrorism, or those tactics of terrorism, and we are talking about anything from indiscriminate violence, even in times of war, that could be considered terrorism, to assassinations of specific heads of states or heads of groups, to genocides or transporting of large populations from one place to the other, specifically because you decided to go against that group. But when we think about most cases of state-sponsored terrorism, when states are engaged in terrorism, but not necessarily directly, it's very cost-effective. It's cheap. It's much cheaper to Use even your own special forces, or in the case of the United States, to use a CIA operation. It's much cheaper than to deploy whole units of the military. It certainly is much cheaper to hire another group or to support another group to do the dirty work for you. Most governments, when they are using terrorism, and especially in the context of foreign policy, but not always, maintain the possible deniability of whatever action happened. Most of the time, and again, this is most of the time, sometimes there is more the direct action, but most of the time, there isn't, if you think about the case of the US, you wouldn't have an open congressional debate to decide and use tactics of terrorism in other countries. Instead, there's a lot of secrecy involved. You're supporting groups that may or may not follow everything that you are saying. And so there's always this possibility of distancing the government, distancing the state, and denying that you are the one that actually pushed for that action. And finally, states use it because it's work. Oppressing people using violence is horrible, but if it's effective and the only thing that you care about is getting to your goal or protecting your interest, then states will continue and use it, okay? So effective, efficient, and the deniability, those are the attractions for states to use terrorism. States could be sponsors, they could be enablers, or they could be work much more closer in cooperations with other groups or with their own agencies when they are using terrorism as a tactic. Some studies, when it looks especially in the domestic arena, we are separating between oppression and repression. Oppression could be just maybe really bad governance, not taking care of people, not paying attention to their grievances, or sometimes even ignoring their grievances specifically. But the difference is that repression is when you are crushing, when you are kidnapping opposition leaders, when you are assassinating people, when you are using violence in order to disperse demonstrations and protests. Those are acts of repression. And when we talk about states terrorism, it's usually that we are crossing the line from oppression to repression. And that line is somewhat important, especially when we're thinking about failed states, because failed states many times, out of lack of knowledge or lack of resources, would use oppression. It is not until they slide into actual repression that you can accuse them in state terrorism. Now, states can use patronage. They can be the ones who are planning an act. So if the United States wanted to assassinate a leader of a group such as Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, we could send our CIA to do it directly, or we could plan, the CIA could plan it and hire operatives, hire local people to do that. In either of those cases, that would be a case of state patronage into terrorism. Or we could just give assistance. Assistance can be moral assistance. You can just support their cause. You can, of course, financially support them, equip them, train them, or actually lend them the personnel to take the action. Now, another thing that you do see that There will be states, and again, this is including Western states, all kinds of Western states, that would say that sometimes in some junctions, under some circumstances, those are legitimate tactics. But they are accepting the tactics and not the title. So you may find, and again, I'm using the example of the United States because this is where we live and it's easier to think about it this way, but this can be in any other country. You may find leaders in the United States advocating specific assassinations of heads of other groups that we deem to be terror groups, for example. So they would say that in some circumstances, the best way to go about is to assassinate the head of that group. However, they would never call that terrorism. So you do find instances where governments will admit using the tactics, but not using the title, right? So they might say, we may use violence or repression or repressive policies at some point, but they would not call that terrorism, which goes back to our discussions about what is terrorism and what does it mean to be called a terrorist and all of those things. And so I would like you to go into the discussion boards, because I have a question there that asks you to think about when, if at all, is it okay for states to use terrorism, thinking about it as a tactic.